Kia ora, welcome to the first series of Stuff That Matters Now, a podcast brought to you by Collective Intelligence. I'm Harv, aka Ian Harvey, founder of Collective Intelligence, and it's going to be my great pleasure in this series to introduce to you a bunch of really cool people who are making a difference in the world every single day. Our job here at Collective Intelligence is to help curious people evolve and become more courageous so they can tackle the stuff that's needed to make this world a better place. Before we crack on and talk about the stuff today's guest had to share with us, a big shout out to Rob McDougall and his talented team at Te Awanga Estate over there in Hawke's Bay. Not only do these guys make international gold medal winning wines, they've helped us bring this podcast to your ears. Brilliant stuff. Thank you, Rod. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for patching in Stuff That Matters Now, podcast brought to you by Collective Intelligence. I am downtown Wellington here on a grey day, and I have got the pleasure of talking to Ian McDougall, who is not a member, but has got more knowledge around collective intelligence than most people I know. I met Ian some years ago when he came and did some work for us, doing some market research, which was hugely valuable. We might relook at that today. Ian owns a company called Business Genetics, based here in Wellington, but works all across New Zealand. You're going to really enjoy this conversation because Ian has got a background that some of us know about, have heard about in the days of Saatchi and Saatchi across the globe, where the kings of sales and marketing and led the world in that area. And Ian was in the company at that stage. And we're going to touch on that and that journey. I'm really looking forward to that. The other thing that, and why I'm talking to Ian specifically today, he's done some market research that we'll get to on skills needed for the future, focusing on one particular generation, but I think is relevant to everybody. And I got a chance to talk to Ian before Christmas, and he showed me this market research he'd done, and I went, mate, would you please give me the time to talk about this on the podcast? So that's what we're doing. So Ian, good morning.
Good morning, Harv.
It is lovely to have you here, and one of the great things with the job I have is I get to meet people like you that otherwise I wouldn't, and so I'm really excited about today, and feel very privileged actually to have you sitting here. And I'm dying to hear, because I don't know your story in detail. I know in the broader sense. And so we're just going to dive straight into that, Ian. I'm really interested to hear your journey and why you picked this industry that you have. So let's just go back to the beginning. You're a New Zealander?
Yes, I am.
Born where?
Born in Lower Hutt, not far from where we're sitting now, actually.
Right. And you've done a huge circle from Lower Hutt and back here.
Yeah, we've spent, my wife and myself and our youngest daughter then, spent a lot of time travelling around the world, mainly with this organisation called Saatchi and Saatchi. And we did a lot of different things in different countries, which I'll touch on because I think they're actually really relevant to the conversation today.
Yeah. And Ian, bearing in mind that, we've heard about this company. Obviously, it was hugely, not so much now, but in your day, it was the king, and you were in the middle of that. So I'm really, really interested in that.
Well, let's start there. I mean, being in the middle of Saatchi and Saatchi then, and I'm talking of a period up until the 90s, the very late 90s, I mean, Saatchi and Saatchi really ran the advertising world. And I don't mean that in a boastful sense. It's a statement of fact that wherever you went in the world, there were a number of Saatchi and Saatchi officers that inevitably excelled in their creative product and the clients that they dealt with, and also in their profitability. And I think that we often felt that when we went into a competitive situation, for example, pitching for a new piece of business, that we were probably unbeatable.
Right.
And again, I know that might sound boastful, but it's really just a measure of the weight and the people in particular that we had working for us then, because I think that's what distinguished the agency. We had the best creative people in particular in the world. I'm not a creative person. I'm a suit, or what we called a suit, and love that work, dealing with clients. Never did the creative production work, but I worked with people that could, and we did some of the best work in the world. And I actually look back now and I'm still really proud of that.
Yeah.
It was a great, fast-moving, exciting era that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Right. So, Ian, and you know, the thing is, you know, I've met you wearing some of the most magnificent suits. What did a suit do in Saatchi? What was your job?
I think that suits clean up the mess, really, because inevitably the relationship between an ad agency, particularly if it's a highly creative one, and slightly mercurial by nature, and a client, those relationships can be fraught with some difficulty. So suits were required to pour oil on troubled waters and take care of clients so the relationships were strong. But to be more specific, my role I always saw as understanding the client's business from the ground up. And that was where I learnt to respect and in fact love marketing research, particularly the type of qualitative research that I'm involved with now, and in fact have been involved in with Harvard Collective Intelligence. The bit that I enjoyed most of all and came to cherish was the conversion of market research learnings into physical strategy that would make a client company, more successful in any marketplace. And to see that play out from interviews with consumers to the formation of market research from which you can draw a conclusion about what a strategy should be, and then to interpret that strategy in the form then of advertising, media, or below the line creativity. It was an extremely powerful and rewarding experience.
And how long would you be involved in? Were you involved in projects or involved in companies?
No, in companies.
Right.
Actually, I think even more specifically, I was involved in brands.
Right.
Because usually the brands override the companies, and the brands and the companies can be two completely different things. So if you take an organisation like Procter & Gamble, who are in fast-moving consumer goods, they don't have a product called Procter & Gamble. They have a product called Head & Shoulders, oil of Ulan, and so on and so forth. So really I was involved with brands. And the duration of that involvement could be anywhere from a year. It averaged out for me at about 5 years. But some of the big brands I was involved with, Lotto was one, Procter & Gamble was another. They lasted for between 8 and 10 years.
This is interesting. We're going to get onto this later on because so your what you're good at is long-term relationships.
Yes. I was very privileged. I got taught from an early point that my fundamental job was to create a trusted and enduring relationship between me, my company, that is the advertising agency, and the client. Because if you have an enduring trusted relationship, you can take that client into new creative or strategic areas that they might not normally go.
Right.
And I believe even in today's world, the 21st century, and we're going to touch on this when we get to this thorny subject called soft skills for the new world, the ability to have judgment and the ability to build trusted and enduring relationships with second parties are formidable skills that we see less of now than we used to.
Interesting.
Yes.
So, Ian, just, and this is a subject all on its own, how do you build trust?
I'm not sure that I can give you a clear answer. I'll give you an answer. But how clear and unambiguous it is, I'm not sure. I think that trust is built on integrity and basic honesty. I think it is built on the repetition of certain actions and behaviours over a long period of time where a second party can go, okay, I see. He or she is behaving in a way that's very, very consistent. And that behaviour has respect, integrity and honesty as the foundation points.
Yeah.
And I think also, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? In the old days when we had a meeting, listen to me, the early days when we had a meeting, it was always face to face. And that allowed you to build trusted and enduring relationships actually in a far quicker way. Today we see relationships being built digitally, and believe me, they're highly effective, and you can build more of them simultaneously. But I think it's a slower process.
Yep.
I think it takes harder work to get to that point of absolute trust. So, the factors involved in that then are respect for the other person, integrity, belief in what you're doing, and also a very deep understanding and commitment to the other person's business.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I've been fascinated with you, Ian, is that you've got this desire to understand other people's business.
Yeah, I've always had this driving curiosity to understand about business and how it impacts society and people.
Right.
So for me, it's not just about building profits. That's obviously a part of it. It's a key part of it when you work for an ad agency, believe me. But I think that, especially today, a company has to have a product or service that is genuinely needed and delivers not just a predictable outcome, but also supports somehow a role in society and somehow making people's lives better, or at least not worse. And if I can leapfrog from there to collective intelligence, I think that was a huge part of my interest in learning about collective intelligence, doing the research and then forming conclusions about where it might go in the future, was that it has enormous and almost unparalleled power to change things, to make people better, to make them more effective, regardless of whether that effectiveness manifests itself professionally or in a personal sense. So I've now met an awful lot of collective intelligence members. As you pointed out, I'm not a member, and there's a very real reason for that, which is it allows me to do the research that I have to do in a very impartial and dispassionate way. But having met a lot of your people, I think they're absolutely phenomenal, the membership, because they do stuff other people don't do. They have a very high level of emotional intelligence. We'll come on to that again in a moment. But collective intelligence is also an organisation that you can't understand in 30 seconds. It's not like a car or a cosmetic. It has layers, and those layers require some intelligence to understand them. But once you get it, the latent power of this thing that you call collective intelligence is absolutely phenomenal. And I see it not just as a New Zealand or an Australasian thing, but a worldwide thing. Sorry, a bit of a long-winded answer, really. But
it's also incredibly flattering. So, Ian, thank you for that. That wasn't part of the script today, but thank you. And it was it's interesting. You've given me a lot of confidence going forward, because there are times you wonder why the hell you're doing this, and having your voice on my shoulder at times has made a huge impact of going. Keep going and keep developing this thing, which is, I wish it was more tangible, and otherwise I'm quite happy that it's not.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, Harv, breaking new ground is always difficult. It's hard to be a pioneer, and that's essentially what collective intelligence is. In all the markets I've worked in, and the markets I continue to work in even today, I can't find a comparable, I can't find a comparable organisation like collective intelligence. It is, I believe, unique. And that's quite an extraordinary thing in a world that has a lot of parity products and services, and a lot of products and services that are simply not differentiated, but collective intelligence is. And I think that's part of the challenge for you as the head of collective intelligence going forward, is to make sure that people understand the power of that differentiation. Yeah.
Work in progress, and you've been a big influencer on that. But so look, thank you for that, and that was that answer was very flattering, and I appreciate it, Ian. Let's go back to, I'm interested in, just for the background, countries you've worked in, and just give us an idea of your journey through your professional career. So from a stage thing, without going into too much detail, and then we're going to drop into some of those interesting bits and pieces.
Sure. I'm a New Zealander, as I said, born in Waifatu, of all places, in La Hut, which incidentally has held me in good stead over the years, I think. I first joined Saatchi in Wellington. They're virtually unrepresented here, which I think is a great shame. But they were at their apex when I joined them. Not because I joined them, but they were just a very, very strong, incredible powerhouse in ad agency terms. And through them, I did secondment projects in New York, Cincinnati, in North America, in London, 1 and 2 very short things in Europe. And then I did quite a period of time for Saatchi in Southeast Asia, which was absolutely fascinating simply because of the sheer growth of that market. Just amazing to see what was happening there. And then back to Australia, Sydney and Melbourne, then back to Auckland, then back to Wellington.
And did you drag your family around?
Well, the answer is yes, but not all of them. So there was my wife Tricia and myself, and our youngest daughter Caitlin. The other girls were older and were either entrenched in education or were in early careers.
Yep.
And we got back to see them, while we were away, and they popped up to places like Jakarta, Indonesia, to see us, which hopefully was quite an experience for them. But in each of those markets, I had the privilege of working for key Saatchi clients who were, they were enormous. For example, I worked on companies like British Airways in London, Lloyds Bank of London. In New York, I worked on Campbell's Soup, which is the biggest. I mean, it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But canned soup. Who would ever have thought? But one of the market leaders around the world, Procter & Gamble, who taught me so much about what I do now. The amazing Toyota, companies like Hewlett-Packard, and an Aussie brand called Lion Nathan, who made beer, which was, forgive the pun, but a rather sobering experience. And so through all of that exposure and experience to research and to marketing strategy, that was essentially the leavening, if you like, that led me to believe at some point I could start this thing called business genetics.
Right. So, and I want to get to that, and we've got plenty of time up our sleeve. Ian, what? This is a guess. Through that time, you would have worked with some stunningly talented, fabulous people.
Yes.
And you would have dealt with some absolute wankers.
Totally.
Yeah. How did you cope with that?
You have to, let's take the wanker side of the equation first. They were almost always clients, which made it particularly problematic. And so I was talking before about respect. And even if I disliked this person, this client sitting on the other side of the table in the meeting, even if I didn't believe in what they believed in, and even if they were obnoxious, I still believed that if I treated them with respect, that we would get through to a position at the end of our conversations that were acceptable to the client and certainly acceptable to the agency. And that was really my job. So that was the difficult side of the equation. The brilliant people could also be extremely difficult to deal with. The brilliant people in my life were all creative people. By that I mean they were the men and women who wrote great advertising, just the best advertising I think that the world's ever seen. So they would be creative directors, writer-based, working in a team with an art director and generating ideas from nothing but a bit of paper that we called a brief. And I had always had an intuitive understanding for what was good creative and what was not good creative. And I looked around the world and I saw a world mainly of poor creative, mediocre creative work.
Yep.
And then suddenly this agency called Saatchi was doing work that brought you to tears, that made you laugh, that made you cry, that made you do stuff. Absolutely.
Made you buy products.
Pardon me?
Made you buy products.
Made you buy products, made you buy services. Made you change views. You know, one of the great campaigns of all time that Saatchi in London did was for the Samaritans.
Right.
And it had a massive effect on the reduction in the suicide rate in London. And stuff like that is so important.
Yep.
But yes, commercially selling products. That's what we did. That's what we got paid for, basically. And the fascinating thing about creative people is that they were at one or other of two extremes. One extreme would be the Mad Men television series creative guy who was high-pitched, noisy, drank a lot, smoked a lot, leapt about, a prima donna type. And they were often very, very good. But the best of all were the quiet ones. And I think that in my time, I think of a creative director in New York, one in London who was with Saatchi for a long time. And you know, Harv, this is really, really interesting. 3 of the best creative directors I ever worked with were all New Zealanders.
Fascinating.
And I worked with them in Saatchi, London and Courtney Place. In fact, not far from where we're sitting right now.
Fascinating. And what made them so good?
They saw things other people couldn't see.
Right.
They came at problems from an oblique angle and turned possibly humdrum products into magic. And they made people laugh and cry.
Right.
They got under the skin. What makes them great? I think an intuitive understanding of the nature of the human being.
Right.
And I think also the ability to think the opposite of what they're thinking.
Explain that.
It's kind of hard to explain in a in a short time. But when you approach any particular problem, be it a business problem or a creative problem, you have a framework within your head that drives you to think about that problem in a particular way. And the great capacity of the brilliant creative directors that I knew was that they had the ability to think the opposite of that.
Right.
And so they could take an idea that would have a predictable outcome expressed in a thing, say, for example, called a 30-second TV commercial. Mm-hmm. But in fact, they would do completely the opposite. And they would surprise the viewer. They would surprise the recipient of that advertising. And that's what made it so creative. Mm. And I suppose if you want an historic view of that, go back to the Impressionist painters, particularly the French Impressionists, who would paint, sounds a bit cheesy really, but who would paint daffodils in a completely different way to the way that a Turner or a Constable would paint them. So it's a different perspective. It's looking at something from a completely different viewpoint and thinking the opposite of what you're thinking, which is not a cliched, predictable approach, but a very different, fresh and new.
Yeah. And, there was an artist up in Manawatu, Paul Dibble, who is, I believe, an international quality sculptor. And the way he will portray a tui and the way he will portray a woman walking. And you just look at it and you look at it and you know it's a Paul Dibble because of the characteristic and it's the way he's interpreted it. And you just go, it's not realistic.
Yeah.
But the way, a woman walking is incredibly feminine, right? There is no way it's a man walking, and it's his own interpretation, and it's beautiful, And another artist I love was Henry Moore in the UK, and the way he would interpret things. And sometimes they were profoundly simple. They weren't complex. You take complex and make it simple. And you look at it and go, that is beautiful. And you go, anybody could do that. Technically, it's not that hard to do. But getting the proportions and the way that that sculpture feels to you, that's the golden juice. It's really hard to describe.
Yeah. Another example is Trish and I were in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and they had, I never know how to pronounce it, it's Munch or Monk. It's a painting called The Scream.
Yes.
And it's a screaming head. And I'd seen pictures of it, and I always found it very disturbing and very horrifying. But seeing it in the flesh, so to speak, I couldn't get any closer to that painting than about 10 feet away, because the painter had taken this notion of doing the opposite of what you're thinking. And instead of portraying a common and garden person, terrified, expressing fear beyond belief almost, what he did, which would have been a completely understandable approach for an artist to take, he distorted it and made it, like when you look in one of those kind of fat mirrors that they have in the old fairgrounds, it's a complete distortion of it. And it's perfectly horrifying. And even now as I talk in front of this microphone, I can see that, and it makes me go quite cold. But that is a really good example of what we're talking about, where a brilliantly creative person has taken a new approach to a predictable topic in a way that delights or frightens people, but is perfectly and totally comprehensible.
There we go. That's it.
That's pretty close to it, I think.
Yeah, and it's art, and can you learn it?
That one's been battered about forever. I can only answer that question, Harv, in the context of creative people and ad agencies. And I think the answer is no, you don't learn it. The ones that I knew, and I'm thinking particularly of three who were New Zealand born and bred and went to the top of their craft, around the world. I don't believe they learnt it.
Yeah.
It was there, it was latent, it was intuitive, and something in them allowed them to bring it out and do this.
And they developed it.
Marvellous work. Then it does go through a process of development, but
Yep.
that development is tweaking and tuning,
Yeah.
it's fine-tuning, it's putting colour and texture,
Yep.
but the general thrust of the creative capacity is innate.
Yeah. So before we move into the present day and the work you've done, Ian, what's your favourite memory through that time working with those companies and brands? Anything that stands out?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one really. Before Spark in New Zealand became Spark, it was called Telecom, and Saatchi had the largest contract for advertising services, and we did, and this is really going to age me, but we did a television commercial called Spot the Dog, which used a dog to demonstrate a whole range of, to be frank, rather prosaic telecom products. I remember glamorous, exciting products like photocopiers,
Yes.
for example, and there was a whole bunch of them that we had to pack into a commercial. And so
Maybe we need to explain what a photocopier is for some of the listeners.
yeah.
And just for people, Spot the Dog was, I think, a Jack Russell or a Terrier or something, right?
Spot the Dog was this very cute Jack Russell
Yeah.
that was highly trained and well wrangled and did all sorts of magnificent things like walk around and sniff in an admirable way this photocopier, which is a thing that you simply stuck in a bit of paper and it copied it.
But Spot the Dog liked the photocopier.
And Spot the Dog loved the photocopier and then did all sorts of very cavalier things like sliding down drain pipes and going through windows. And the world loved it. And the post-research on the commercial was unbelievable. It was one of the most extraordinary cut-through commercials that existed in New Zealand ever at that time.
Because I remember Spot the Dog sort of saved the world a few times, didn't they?
Yeah.
You know, went through incredible weather and, you know, it was really, in this very, very short time span, you'd watch Spot the Dog on this adventure. And, you know, he was very heroic. And then always at the end, he was always so bloody happy.
He was, well, he was actually. He was a happy dog, and I actually think that the real Jack Russell delighted in being in front of the cameras.
Yes.
I think, you know, the little guy was born to be an actor. And to come back to your question, the memorable bit of all this was that, slightly to my surprise, I had a call from a creative awards ceremony based in New York City who said, can you come over because we want you to attend an awards ceremony? And I said, why on earth would I do that? And they said, well, you entered a commercial for this company called Telecom and we think it might do quite well. And I said, well, does that mean we've won or not? And they said, well, we can't tell you that, sir, you know. And I talked to my boss, and he said, yeah, sure, go. And so you hop on this plane, and I ended up staying in this magnificent Philippe Stark hotel. It was all getting a bit Mad Men, actually. And I went along to this function, and they played the winning commercials, and Spot won kind of top in the show. And I can just remember receiving the award on stage, and it was a golden statuette. They really love, you know, Oscar-type statuettes over there. And looking out into the audience, and I was the only New Zealander there, and the rest were American, they were Italian, French. They were from all over the world. There may have been a couple of Australians.
Big crowd, all black tie.
It was all black tie. It was post this most amazing dinner and beautifully hosted, as you can imagine. And there's Ian McDougall from Saatchi in Wellington standing on the stage looking out into the audience.
From Lower Hutt.
From Waifa 2 in Lower Hutt. Going, this is an experience I will never forget because it showed me that at that point in time, the company and the office I worked for was literally the best in the world. That was nothing to do with me. That was to do with the agency that was then at the top of its game. It was a phenomenal experience, and I have never forgotten that. And it's held me in really good stead, because inevitably careers go through flat spots, and you start to get self-doubt, and you start to wonder if, are you really any good at what you do? And I think back to that time and I go, yeah, I think we were pretty good, you know. I think we were pretty good.
Yeah.
So
you had the flat spots, Ian?
It's inevitable. The thing about ad agencies in those times was you worked very, very hard. Work days were long. Client meetings were difficult. The constant need to provide to corporate goals, financial targets, and so on. I was handling two of the biggest accounts in New Zealand at the time. They were huge, even by today's standards.
Yep.
They'd be considered huge. I'm sorry, in terms of how much they spent. And it wore me out, and I started suffering from basic burnout.
Yep.
And at that point, I quit, because I had committed to my family to take a year off, and I did that. I only lasted 7 months, bored out of my brain. Absolutely and utterly bored out of my brain, living in paradise on the beach in Raumati Sao. And I got offered a job in this place called Jakarta, Indonesia. And I thought, what the heck?
Right.
I went up and had a look. Craziest place I've ever seen in the world.
Yep.
About 23 million people in Jakarta alone.
Right.
And I thought, this will do me nicely, thank you. Here is excitement.
7 months. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That whole, burnout's a terrible thing, but then, yeah, sitting there twiddling your thumbs is just not for some people.
I formed a theory around that, and that is that if you're male or female today and resign and retire, there's quite a good chance that you'll die early. And the reason for that is that it's an emotional issue, not a physical issue. You lose your value. And so I found that when I came out of the job I was describing before, and sat on a beach, I felt extremely valueless.
Yep.
And it's such a mild word, isn't it? Valueless. But the impact on your psychology is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I found that very hard to deal with. I had to be out there doing stuff. I had to be in meetings. I had to be mixing with people, making things happen, producing stuff, either commercially or socially. So I was very glad to pick up a job in Southeast Asia, with
23 million people around it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Ian, let's just move forward now to business genetics. And before I forget, I just want to, before listeners listen to this next segment, what amazed me was that a little company like Collective Intelligence could actually afford to use Ian to do some market research for us and get some stunning information. I remember when I met you and I got a sense of where you'd come from, and then I thought, we started talking about doing some market research for us. My immediate reaction was, we could not afford you. Mm. And so just for people listening to this before we go forward, is that, and it's funny, I'm not doing this for you, Ian, to plug business genetics, because I'm doing this for listeners to go, you're there, and they can get access to you. And we'll put the website thing and stuff, your website on the bottom of the blog and so forth. But I think it's a really important point that I just couldn't get over, that we, a small company like us, could afford to use you the way you've structured it and to tap into all this experience that you've got. I think it's such a wonderful asset for New Zealand that people need to know about. So listening, coming forward, guys, don't think I couldn't afford to get access to Ian, because he can. It's fabulous the way he's set up his business now for that to happen. So Ian, how long has Business Genetics been going?
5 years.
Yep. And what was the motivation? So you come out of, what was the stage you'd been in just before that?
I was head of business development for a major agency in Auckland.
Yep.
And it was a role I did not like, and had determined to leave. And I said, well, if I'm going to leave, I'm going to do things my way and start my company.
Right.
The time has come.
Yep. Just do your own thing.
Yeah, just do my own thing and do it my way. And if it succeeded, it would succeed because of me. And if it failed, it would fail because of me. And I like that sense of complete exposure.
Yep. So what's your way? Let's start there.
Right. Okay. So this touches on some ideology that's really important to me, and I think is really important to small to medium-sized businesses out there. And in New Zealand, it goes like this. It's really, really simple. There are two parts to it. One is the research methodology that I use, which is very fast and very low in cost. And the second bit is the belief that my business has to be accessible to any SME. And I have worked for a small company that had one person in it. And I'm currently working for a company at the top end of the large piece of small to medium-sized category, which has got 400 people. To get to the point, all of the strategic work that I do is based on a thing called qualitative research, which uses small numbers of face-to-face interviews that I conduct, 1 hour in duration. And I might conduct somewhere between 5 and 35 interviews, depending on the complexity of the issue. And I can conclude those interviews in 1 week and have the recommendations written the following week. But because it is qualitative, because it is simply time-based, the cost of that is remarkably low. And I wanted pricing to be affordable for the types of companies that I wish to work for. So, and I mean no harm by this, but I have no desire to work for major corporates anymore.
Yep.
I want the really hot, small, nimble, the really interesting young companies that are the backbone of New Zealand today.
Yep.
The 21st century New Zealand companies are extraordinary, and there's a lot of them actually in collective intelligence. So there is that point about the research methodology, low in cost and very, very fast.
The key to this, though, Ian, is that your experience to ask the right questions, right? Because I think, it's very easy to go, okay, that's methodology, but the IP that I see is what's in your head and the questions you ask in that 1 hour. Yeah,
well, I write the questions. I do not call it a questionnaire, I call it a discussion guide, because part of it's a very organic process. It flows everywhere, and that's where you get the really rich stuff coming out of respondents. But your point is fundamentally right. Because of my commercial background and also quite a lot of societal work I've done in my career, I know what the questions are to which we need answers if we are to form a coherent strategy from a particular business situation.
And you'd have no idea what the outcomes are going to be?
I always have a view on what they might be.
Right.
But I discount those so that when I go into interviews, I have no preconception about what the outcome will be. And that's incredibly important, because if one of the great dangers of being a researcher is to go into any interview situation with a predetermined outcome. And I do not do that. I cannot do that.
Yep.
You have to be completely dispassionate. But of course, I'm human. I have a view on how things might be.
Yep.
I've seen analogous situations in other markets around the world, and you kind of go, well, you know what, it'll probably come out somewhere like this.
Right.
And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
So you go in and ask all of those questions. But coming back to accessibility, that word accessible is really, really important to me, because part of this ideology was I want to be a one-person company that can be hired by anybody, provided the anybody is doing something important,
Right.
in a commercial or societal sense.
Right.
And I can adjust pricing accordingly, but overall I have this philosophy that says I must be accessible.
Yeah.
And as it happens, that gives me a very significant competitive edge in a market that in fact has dozens, literally, of research companies involved. I think what distinguishes business genetics is I use research as a means to an end, and in fact I write the end, which I call recommendations.
Right. Yes, which is what we got.
Which is what you got.
Yep.
So here is the research, here is the evidence. I look at the verbatims in particular from respondents and say, here are the strategic implications. And then I will form a conclusion around those strategic implications that says, look, here's what I think you should do and here's the reason why. It's very effective.
What was interesting from the work you did for us, Ian, is that I think the most tangible thing we got from your research was confidence.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. You know, we got some stuff to do, but we got a lot of confidence that somebody else, third party, not close to us, got access to our members and asked, you know, and you were specific. You wanted not just people who are happy, you wanted people, and we gave you some people who'd left as well.
You did.
A whole range of people.
You did.
And I think that was a fascinating thing, the amount of confidence. And I had no idea what we were going to get back.
No. Well, when a CEO commissions the kind of research I do, it's a very fearful time, because the CEO doesn't know what he's going to get back or what she's going to get back.
Yep.
And often, if the research is damning towards a particular organisation, the person immediately responsible from the board's viewpoint is the CEO. So it's fraught with considerable problems of exposure. That hasn't happened much, but it certainly happened to me where I've had to deliver quite appallingly bad news about how companies are performing from a customer perspective, and they are never pleasant or easy conversations. That was not the case with collective intelligence. What I found was even with members who had left, and I can remember one or two who had left in, I suppose, stormy circumstances, but had the utmost regard for the process and the people of collective intelligence. And I thought, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
What's this about? And what it was actually about was the bedrock behind collective intelligence, how it works, and particularly what it produces, like the outputs that it gets to, are quite formidable, and they're recognised highly. So I was able to deliver research findings to you, to collective intelligence, from the members who were very open about what they really thought. And they were incredibly complimentary and supportive about the process, because I could see firsthand that it had changed them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty satisfying when that happens. And it's not perfect, but from time to time we do good work.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think now I'm really interested to get to this latest piece of research that you've done, because the thing I love about this is that it's hot off the press. And so just frame up for us so you did this research for a company?
Yes, correct.
Yep. And they've allowed you to keep the results or something, or use the results?
Right. I should explain that, because the the work was done for a client, and between the client and my company, there exists a thing called a non-disclosure agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So I cannot divulge who the client was, but they have given me full permission to conduct this interview with you and to disclose the findings, because the findings are actually really, really important to New Zealand commercially, and socially. And so
what was the brief?
Right. Well, the brief was for me to interview Generation Z.
Yep.
Now, Generation Z is young people born between 1997 and 2012. And the reason that we selected that audience, male and female, was that they would be the leaders of tomorrow in companies. And the purpose was to define the characteristics of these effective business managers for the 21st century, looking at management roles, say, 5 to 10 years out. So what are the characteristics, what are the strengths of these people that will be critical for them to be successful, say, in a decade's time? There was another layer to the brief which was slightly more complicated. And in fact, it turned out to be very complicated, but we got there in the end, which was the client was keen to understand that if, for example, they had a room full of Generation Z candidates for a particular job, what are the one or two distinguishing factors they should look for over and above all of the basic hygiene stuff?
Right.
So the theory as it came to me from my client was Generation Z go roughly to the same kind of schools. They go to colleges that are roughly the same. They go to universities that are roughly the same. They often do very similar degree courses. They come out of university and do jobs that are quite similar. And so over a 10-year period, you have a whole bunch of people with basically similar stuff in their heads.
They would use the same social media platforms. They would have been exposed to a lot of similar stuff.
So parity and similarity are kind of words that came up all the time. Now, this is not a value judgment. This is simply an observational fact that worried my client enormously. Now, these Generation Z people, very bright. Very, very bright. PhDs, masters, very clever, very skilled. But essentially they had a background frame of reference that was kind of the same. So therefore, if you want to appoint a manager now who's going to reach their zenith for your company 10 years out, what are the distinguishing factors?
Right. And
we ended up with two of them, which I'll come to in a second. Did I kind of give you the background?
Yeah, I think I've been listening because we went through this before, a month or so ago. I'm going, is that enough of a framework? So basically, to summarise it, what are the key things that are going to set people apart to manage and lead going forward?
Yes.
Yep. With this and with this particular generation, and I mean the listeners can sort this out for themselves. But I think that it is what you've done is not just for this generation, because I think it crosses over most of the generations, if not all of them.
Yeah, it's intergenerational.
Yeah, it is. It is. So you've taken this snapshot. Okay.
Right. So I talked to slightly more than 30 people, and the conversations lasted for 1 hour.
Yep.
Actually, in some cases, they went to almost 2 hours. I completed all this last year. The sample was Generation Z, people that we'd consider future executives. A number of them were interns in major companies or were in early management or had been promised management positions in 18 months. So quite a select group who actually knew what they were talking about. And so we started talking.
And they were happy to be interviewed?
They were delighted to be interviewed.
Yep.
And they were very articulate.
Yep.
And very considered. They did not know the questions that I would be asking them before the interview. And that's very important. I'll go into it in 10 seconds, but I wanted to say first up that there was a very high level of consensus. So I'm talking to 32 different people. On every question, there was a lot of commonality.
Okay.
And that gives you a very high level of confidence in the accuracy of the data.
Yep.
So what emerged was 8 factors.
Okay, so what we're going to go through now is Ian's looking at a piece of paper with the results of the research, and you've got 8 different factors that you have identified that are going to be critical for them, basically to set themselves apart.
Correct.
Yeah, going forward.
Correct.
So we're just going to start in alphabetical order and go through them. Yeah?
We are.
Cool. Go.
So bear in mind too that these words are not my words or halves. These are the words from the people we interviewed, the Generation Z men and women who are going to be managing companies or social organisations in the future. I'm going to give you the 8, and then I'm going to quickly go back and talk about what each one means. So the factors that emerged, and remember what this is called is in quotes, quote, soft skills for the new world, unquote. That was the subject of the brief. So the skills are agility, ambiguity, emotional intelligence, failing, flexibility, forming trusted, enduring relationships. There's that one again. Integrity. And the last one, judgment.
Okay.
So, backing up, agility, what does agility mean? So, my questions were designed...
Just before, did you know you were going to end up with 8? You would have...
No.
No, okay, so the 8 that came out, that was just what fell out of the research.
Correct.
Cool, okay.
So I thought actually that I might get 4 or 5.
Right, okay. Because it's a long list.
It's a long list, but it's an important list. And it's important for one reason. So I'm glad you stopped me there. It's important because each of these relate to each other. They are not separate standalone issues.
Yep.
So the managers of tomorrow are expected to show an overlay between each of these characteristics.
Yep.
Obviously, they'll have some strengths in some areas, perhaps weaknesses in others, but they have to have a blend or an amalgam of them all. So the first one I mentioned was agility, and what agility means in this context is dexterity. The ability to shift from one state to another, the ability to recognise market, social or political changes that are of importance to a commercial organisation or to a social organisation. And agility is also about responsiveness to be able to impact these shifts very rapidly.
Right.
So it is about the ability to say, we've detected a change in the market, we need to be agile and address that change by doing X, Y, Z.
Yep.
Often referred to as nimbleness, agile.
Because you see it in companies when they
responsive.
cannot do it.
Oh, you see it in companies when they can't do it immediately.
Yeah.
The companies I've interviewed completely separate of this issue And I'm thinking now of a couple in Wellington and a couple in Auckland who have about 5 or 6 people working for them. They would be in a late stage of startup. Their degree of agility is absolutely phenomenal.
Yep.
So they can take on the big companies, the big slow corporate dinosaurs, and they can beat them unbelievably fast and at lower cost and with a higher level of service simply through agility.
Yeah.
But most importantly, being connected to the market to detect what the consumer changes are before they become apparent.
Yep. So the managers are going to have to be able to lead teams to, because that's going to be the difficult thing, right? So an individual can be agile, but to have a team that's agile is going to develop, you're going to need a whole lot of skill to be able to do that.
Correct. So when that manager is hiring people for the team, agility will be a core characteristic.
Okay. Yep.
But I think my point, Harv, is that if the manager has a high level of agility, almost by osmosis, they will attract people of the same ilk.
Yep.
But today's world shifts so quickly. Digital internet, all of that very obvious stuff changes the world from day to day. Look at politics, for example.
Yeah, I think one of the important things with agility, though, Ian, is not to get it mixed up with sort of chaos. So there's a big difference between agility and chaos, because I think some people think agility sort of looks chaotic, but agility is not chaotic. It's fluid, and it can be a very graceful shift. Correct. But it can happen very quickly. So, it can't get too confusing.
No, I mean, the issue of chaos comes into the very next point. So the one that we just addressed was agility. The next one is ambiguity, which overlays nicely with this idea of chaos. And I'm certainly not going to go into chaos theory, but ambiguity here means the ability to manage ambiguity, to accept that it will be part of your personal and professional life, and to handle it in a professional and analytical sense. And the best definition of ambiguity came from a female manager who I think will just be absolutely incredible in the future, in either a social organisation or a commercial organisation. And I asked her to define ambiguity, and she said ambiguity is the capacity to manage ambiguity, in business or social relationships or situations while avoiding paralysis.
Right. So that's the last bit is the most important, right?
Correct. So those last words, while avoiding paralysis, is usually the outcome from chaos or situations of great ambiguity, is that we don't know what we're dealing with, we're not quite sure how to approach it, we have conflicting pieces of information, we become paralysed. And I see this in companies, huge and small, all the time. So you need to break down, analyse why things appear to be ambiguous, take them to their root cause, and then become agile in developing solutions.
A new solution.
And that's actually all that. Chaos is often considered to be a good thing. Personally, I have a view that's completely the opposite, because I think that chaos produces a bunch of people who become responsive only to situations and never become strategic. Whereas the ability to handle ambiguity is totally about getting to strategic, coherent solutions from what appears to be chaotic or ambiguous.
Yep.
I hope that's not too abstract.
No, it's not. It's because it's amazing how those two are so overlapped.
Totally overlapped.
Yeah. And, I know there are times I've become paralysed, and it's just horrible. You're just like a stunned mullet going, fuck, what am I supposed to be doing? And you just haven't actually got to the root cause of what is going on.
Absolutely. Look, there's I just wanted to give it's a quote actually from a guy called Bertrand Russell, who was an English mathematician turned philosopher. And he said that he turned to philosophy because it allowed him to live in a world of ambiguity without being paralyzed by hesitation. It's a fantastic quote. And it's about 80 or 90 years old, I suppose. I might have that wrong. He's been dead for a while. Controversial figure. But that's exactly what we're talking about, because chaos and ambiguity leads to paralysis, which means you don't do anything.
Yep.
And not doing anything in the 21st century is instant death, really.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so this next one, emotional intelligence.
Yeah, well, this one gets bandied about a lot. And to be frank, I'm tired of sitting in huge meetings with major corporates where usually the most senior male in the room talks about being highly emotional intelligent, and they've got the emotional intelligence, of a battle tank, really. It's something that came out in the research as being incredibly important. And what emotional intelligence means is around empathy and the understanding of another person that transcends rational or commercial requirements. Let me explain that for a moment. You're in a conversation with someone you haven't met before, or you're in a conversation with someone that you've known all your life. You will have in your head a desired outcome for that conversation. But what that person is actually looking for is your understanding of them that goes way beyond a commercial outcome or a societal outcome. And essentially what that second party is saying is, treat me as a human being, treat me as a person, love me, like me, understand me. But even if you hate me, accept me. And I think that kind of stretch is exactly the sort of emotional intelligence required in the future. And where it's going to become really, really important is you would have detected a shift in the way that companies manage themselves from the older male style of command and control. Here's the strategy, do this, do that. Have you done it? How well have you done it? To a management system based around collegiality and collaboration. And when you live in a company driven by collegiality and collaboration, you have to have a high level of emotional intelligence. And interestingly, emotional intelligence is one of the great is one of the great factors that allows you to handle ambiguity. So you start to see how these various apparently disparate points actually work together.
Look, it's interesting that I see the world changing from transactions to connections. That let's get a connection first before we do any transaction. And if the connection is not right and it doesn't feel right and our values don't lie, there's no point entering the next stage of transaction.
No, you're absolutely right. I would have used a slightly different term. I would have said we're in a world moving from transactions to relationships.
Yep.
That's the only difference have. And if you accept that every piece of commercial or societal endeavour is a relationship, then it automatically follows that you must have a high level of emotional intelligence. Otherwise, that relationship will self-destruct.
Yep.
Because the element of collaboration, collegiality is missing.
Yep. Look, it's I've got a thing on my office that says get interested in other people's reality, and I've got that next to my desk, and I've got that because I forget to do that. Right, when I get triggered by something or I'm tired, I think, look, just sort out my problem or whatever, or go away. That's the worst space I get in, and I just lose all patience and so forth, right? And it's just like, oh, fuck this, it's just all too hard. And it's there to remind me, get interested in their perspective, because they've got a perspective and it's real. And things go a lot better when I get interested in their perspective.
Absolutely.
You know, but it's not, sometimes it's not very easy to do. Yeah.
So we've covered agility, ambiguity, and emotional intelligence. The one I want to get onto now is about failing. And this is just fantastic. What failing means is being allowed to fail and having the capability to handle your own failure, but to learn from it by understanding the causality of the failing and to form principles for future behaviours around that. Now, a very good example is the Honda motor company out of Japan. So Honda was started by Soichiro Honda himself, and his simple ideology was, we are going to build cars that will rate with any other manufacturing company in the world, and we're going to get there by failing, which means that all of the people in my design teams, the bolt cutters, the people that assemble, the people that spray the paint, the people that build the engines, will be allowed to fail, provided they learn how to do it better.
There you go. That's the key there, isn't it?
Correct.
Provided you learn to do it better.
Yeah. And so, you know, it touches on this very powerful notion that experience in its own right is not material. What is material is when you convert experience, in this case failures, into learnings, into principles, into laws that will stop you failing again in that particular area in the future. But the greatest inventions of all time have come from continual failure, and I won't bore you to death with the Edison analogy, the light bulb thing, but it's actually still a pretty good example of why it's important to fail.
Yeah, look, I think that, you know, and it's interesting, I don't like the... I'll change that. I didn't used to like the word failing, but I've learnt to... I'm a lot happier with the word failing now as I get older, because I understand how important it is, where before it just sucked. You know, it was just like there was no upside to failing. Yeah. Okay. Which, interesting, ties into the emotional intelligence, because when you've failed is then to be able to keep yourself together and go, what actually happened then, rather than just sulking. Yeah.
Because when you understand what happened, then it becomes a principle that you can adopt going forward, and it then presents failure in a different light. It wasn't actually a failure, it was simply part of the learning process. So it's quite a different thing. It goes from negative to positive. I wanted to talk about flexibility. So this is the 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the fifth learning from the research. On the surface, flexibility seems to be pretty obvious. It's around the whole idea of tractability in people. And it's about having working relationships. Working relationships, I don't necessarily mean in a commercial sense. It might be a working relationship with your wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Societal relationships with different people, relationships of any kind. They have to be tractable. And that means that we must avoid rigidity in thinking and behaviour. And I have seen over my career, regardless of what country I've been working in, I've seen product or commercial failures often occur through rigidity in thinking or behaviour. This is the way that we've done it. This is the way we must continue to do it. This is the policy of the company. It's that kind of rigidity that's the opposite.
That's the way we do it here. That's the way we do it here.
That's right. And so That issue around flexibility impressed me enormously when I can remember when I was doing the collective intelligence interviews, which now go back a couple of years, possibly even longer, is that the people I was interviewing had a very, very high level of flexibility. So they would state a position on something, but you could then talk about the position that they had taken. They would accept and absorb that information and then form a different position. So they were constantly moving based on new incoming information. That's the kind of flexibility I'm talking about, as opposed to the kind that says, no, don't even want to talk about that.
Yep.
Because that is opposed to the way I've been taught to do it.
Ian, look, this is... I had a fascinating conversation last night around politics, and I was with some people who are very attuned to one particular party.
Yeah.
And I said, have you ever voted for another party? No, we've always voted this party. I said, that's interesting. And so even if your party was not any good, you'd still vote for them? Yes. I went, interesting. And they said, well, who do you vote for? I said, well, I vote. I line up at the election and go, I have no idea who I'm going to vote for, because I actually want to listen to them and form my opinion as we go forward. And it was fascinating to see just how rigid they were. And I know when you're rigid, you only hear certain stuff. You know, your side's good, their side's bad. End of story. And it's just not true. I don't believe anyway.
No, it's not true. It's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to...
And so the difference between flexibility and agility?
Flexibility is about avoidance of rigidity. Agility is the ability to shift from one state to another. It tends to be bigger, and it tends to be based on speed of responsiveness.
Yep. Okay. And they
are quite close, actually.
But these two will be tied together, right?
Absolutely.
So all of these things so far are tied together.
They overlay.
Yep.
Correct.
Cool.
Which is why I said earlier you have to look for a candidate that's got all of these characteristics.
Right. Okay. Number 6.
Right. Well, actually, what I want to do is I want to I want to talk about integrity, and then I'll come back to the last two characteristics, which are highly distinguishing characteristics.
Cool.
So integrity, gets battered about all the time. And yet integrity cannot be claimed by an individual. It is only conferred on an individual. So integrity is like this word trust. You can never, never, ever say, I'm a trustworthy person. Trust is imposed upon you or not by second parties.
You earn it.
You earn trust. You behave in a way that shows you to be trustworthy at all times, and those people have integrity. And I was trying to get from my respondent interviewers what integrity really meant. And I put together an amalgam of different views which came out like this, that integrity is consistent, observed behaviour founded on honesty, transparency and delivery. And I think the key words there are that however you're behaving is clearly observable. It is based on the idea of consistency, that you behave in a particular way all the time, so that you become, I suppose, reliable is a crude word to put on that. But you exhibit characteristics of honesty and transparency, and you always deliver something, an action, idea, a product, a service, the point of view, when you say you will do it. Now, I mean, when those words come out of my mouth, I go, well, it seems so obvious and almost seems a bit cheesy. But in fact, it took a lot of interviews to get to that point. And that, in fact, is how the market is, Generation Z market is defining integrity.
So the interesting thing there is the transparency, right, which is hugely important. And when we talk about these other ones, okay, of failing and flexibility and ambiguity, right, things aren't black and white anymore. So being trustworthy and having integrity when things are predictable and so forth, right, that's a whole different skill than having integrity and transparency when things are fluid. I think those are a vastly different type of integrity. And I think the integrity going forward is going to take more to master going forward. Because we trust black and white, okay, we've delivered that, where going forward we won't even know what they need to deliver sometimes, right? Because it's going to be not so clear.
True.
So I think the integrity thing is even more complex than it's been in the past.
Yes, I think it has.
And I think transparency is going to be, is a key part of that.
Well, I think transparency wraps up all of the things we've been talking about. If you're transparent, then you will be consistent. You will behave in a responsible way. You will exhibit pieces of behaviour that are welcomed and respected, even if the other person doesn't particularly want to hear that point of view at that time.
Yep. So those are the first 6, and you've left the last 2 as these are the 2 crunchy, critical ones.
Correct. So here's where we get to it. So
I've been pretty happy so far, Ian, with
okay, fine.
No, the first 6, you go, yeah, that's a hell of a list.
Well, it is a hell of a list. It's a hell of a list too if you put yourself in the practical position of interviewing Generation Z candidates for a particularly important management job that might be coming up in 18 months, say. You're going to be working pretty hard to find a person who exhibits high on each of these factors. But in fact, they do exist. Yeah. And I know that because the majority of the respondents, 30-odd, all met those requirements to varying degrees.
Right.
So the issue here is if we end up with a whole room full of Generation Z candidates, what are the 2 important factors that will distinguish the candidate I want for my job? And the 2 are, we touched on it before, forming trusted, enduring relationships. That is the ability to form trusted and enduring relationships with other people. And the second one is judgment. So given that we've already broken ground on the enduring relationship thing, I'll talk about that one first. What it means is that it signifies a completely dependable relationship that you can build beyond the normal state of expected behaviours. I may be in a commercial relationship with a second party. I may be in a social relationship with a second party. I have expectations of how they will behave, how they'll talk to me, how they'll address me, that they'll follow through on things, they'll stay in touch, they'll be a human being. But enduring relationships are built on something that goes beyond that. And a lot of the conversations that have built enduring relationships in my time have started off with the words, yes, but have you thought about this? Where you have introduced a completely different idea into a second person's world that they may in fact be uncomfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
They may in fact oppose it. But somewhere in that opposition, there is this factor that the second person says, you know, that guy, in this case Ian, didn't have to say that, probably knew it might upset me, but he said it anyway because I think he thinks that it will make me a better person or a more informed person. And there's an element of that transparency that we talked about before. But there's very much a sense of rigorous honesty here. But time and time again, people can connect over a lifetime and they will never have a trusted, enduring relationship.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't know, I suppose I've been quite fortunate, and I've always understood the importance of respect here, but I can usually develop a relationship that is trusted and enduring quite quickly. And it's all based around honesty, transparency, delivery, consistency.
So why does it endure? Why does it endure?
Because the second party believes that when everyone else is telling them rubbish or telling them what they want to hear, that this is a person who will tell them the truth. The biggest problem that chief executives have today, in my view, and they will admit this, I think, is that they're too protected. They're too protected from the realities of the business and the market. And the reason for that is they have around them a whole lot of people who are essentially sycophantic, tell them what they want to hear. So an enduring relationship is one where you go, this person is my working colleague or my friend, and sometimes I hate them because they tell me the truth.
Yep.
But I know that this is one person in my lifetime that will tell me what I have to be told.
Yep.
It's a very, very important characteristic, and it lies at the very heart of the ability to form a trusted, enduring relationship.
So, Ian, do you and I have a trusted, enduring relationship?
Yes, I believe we do.
Mm.
And the reason for that, which is germane to the conversation, is that when I reported back to you the results from your members, the interview respondents, you accepted them with a lot of questions, and some of them I think were quite painful. But you heard them and you adjusted the business and you adjusted your own mental state to it. So that was an important part of that relationship building. So I'd say categorically, yes, we do have.
Mm.
Yes, we do.
Mm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and it's you know, it sounds such a simple thing to do, Ian, doesn't it? It sounds such a simple thing to do, but it takes it's bloody uncomfortable sometimes. And you know, one of the wonderful, fortunate things for me is I'm surrounded by a team of facilitators who tell me shit whether I like it or not. And you pick up great information, and it makes our bond stronger as a result. Yeah, that uncomfortable bit.
Yeah.
So this is one of the critical things you've pointed out.
It's one of the two. The other one, shall I go into that now?
No, just before we wrap up on that one. So to be clear, this is a key element needed for Generation Z going forward, for them to be able to develop those relationships.
Yes. So come back to my earlier analogy. I'm sitting in a room with 4 different candidates for a very important job that's going to kick in 18 months' time. They all have essentially the same knowledge. They have the same educational level, roughly.
Yep.
They're kind of the same people. Their frames of reference are similar, and of course they're all Generation Z.
Yep.
What I'm looking for now are what are the 1 or 2 or more elements that will say this person is probably better than the others, and this is one of those 2 characteristics.
So you know, we haven't got time for it today, but how the hell do you interview to find that out?
Well, the obvious way is to get them to give you examples,
okay,
and then contact that exemplary person as a referee.
Okay. So the reference check becomes even more.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. All right. So that's one of the critical of the 8, and then the last one
is judgment. I've never yet met a person, a client, a friend, an interview respondent who has admitted to having poor judgment. And yet most people do. I do on some subjects.
I'm not saying anything.
The question I get asked about this one is judgment learned or innate? And I think the psychiatrists among us are going to hate this, but I think it's innate. I think that experience and knocking about the real world teaches you things about judgment, but I think essentially judgment is highly intuitive. And there are degrees of intuition, and most intuition's based on learned facts anyway, particularly if you subscribe to, say, to Malcolm Gladwell, who talked about it in his book. I think it was called Blink.
Blink, yeah.
But my experience is in the people, let me say it this way, the clients I have met in my career who exhibited the finest, most magnificent pieces of judgment that I have ever seen, I believe it was largely intuitive.
Mm.
So what it means, however, to make this less abstract, what judgment means, and again, these words belong to the interview respondents, is the ability to convert experience into principles that guide sound counsel in matters of complexity or lack of precedent. So it's a bit wordy and a bit highfalutin.
Yeah, do that again, because you lost me there.
So I have, we're talking about judgment, and I'm talking about the ability to take a whole lot of intuitive or real-life experience and say what that means in terms of a law or a principle is this. And we'll call this X. We'll give it the power of X. And therefore, I can use X as a guiding rule or bedrock when I'm making a decision in completely unknown territory. Because the hardest decisions are what I call the 49-51 decisions. So if as a manager you are asked to make a decision that's a 90-10 decision, that's very easy and very safe. If it's 60-40, it's okay. You can do that. But if it's 49-51, and essentially that's what you get paid for as a CEO, to make the hard ones, it's not so easy. And so what you do is you rely on that sense of intuition, the Malcolm Gladwell thing, but you also try to put together everything that you've learnt, stripped back to the most simple of ideas or concepts. And out of that will come generally a clear view on what judgment you should make. But I have seen CEOs make incredibly important decisions, literally in the blink of an eye, and they have proven to be magnificently correct over a long, long period of time.
And I'm just looking at the list here, Ian, and going back to failing and to EQ and ambiguity and agility, flexibility, integrity. Those are all tied up. The overlap is phenomenal.
Well, the reason that judgment comes at the end of the exposition of the 8 factors, is that judgment requires all of those things working together.
Yeah.
And it becomes an amalgam, it becomes a melting pot. And that's where a lot of intuition comes from. It is simply a collection of a whole lot of stuff at which you failed. And that's why that one aspect of failure is so important.
So then how, when you are selecting a team, do you identify this trait? Oh, I like this. He's all quiet.
Well, I was in the context of this exercise, this piece of research, I was asked to sit in on an interview with a candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And my client asked me that question, which kind of was rephrased like, Ian, if you're so smart about this stuff, come and help me pick the right person. In fact, there were 2 people. One was male, one was female. And the honest answer is, the only way that I could do that was to bring in a psychiatrist It was actually a clinical psychologist who sat in on the interviews and did a lot of the hard yards, trying to understand what the background was to each individual in terms of their judgmental abilities. So their work ranged from what do you believe about this issue, and this issue was a societal issue, for example, like global warming, for example. It's got nothing to do with the job, but it's got a lot to do with judgments that they can make, all the way through to give me examples, please, of difficult judgment situations, 4951 situations, where you made a decision, and tell me how you applied judgment to that.
Right.
And then you would check out the veracity of that, because you're at the hard bit of the interview, you're at the sharp end of it, when candidates who desperately want a job are going to lie. So you need to make sure that they're not.
And Ian, that question, I'm just sitting there going, oh, I'm so pleased I'm not asked that question, because that's a cooker.
Mm.
I'd lie. I'd be sitting there going, what? No, yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, it's a killer. It's a killer. But you see, let's just remind ourselves that this is not the employers or the companies or the social organisations talking about judgment. This is the people themselves, the Generation Z young men and women who are going to be handling these jobs, that are saying, we think judgment is one of those two critical factors that will distinguish us.
Yeah, good reminder.
For a high-level management job in the future.
Yeah.
But it's a tricky one.
So I've just been reflecting on that, Ian, because you've been asking young people, right? In my generation would have just asked the old people, right? Because they know. Right, this is flipping it completely around and asking the young people, what is it? Yeah, it's fascinating, because I watch people of my generation struggle, because when I was a young person, all we had to do is just copy what had been before us, right? And you copy that. The person that copies that the best fits in well. The world's totally different to that now.
Yes, it is.
You know, these kids, I call them kids. I mean, they're not looking to follow us. They're looking to totally...
No, they're breaking new ground.
Yeah, breaking new ground.
They... I mean, I'm kind of way older now, and I have enormous respect and regard for young people, and in this context, particularly for Generation Z, because they know what they don't know. And my whole career has been dealing with clients who often believe they know what they know, and they don't. And the consequences of that can be quite catastrophic.
Yep.
So Generation Z will say, well, here's what I know, because I learnt it in university, and I learnt it as a principle that I established when I had this particular experience in my first job, my second job, whatever. But the question you're posing now, I don't know the answer to that, but I think I know how I might be able to find the answer. And I think that particularly relates to areas like judgment, which are abstract. And yet, I was just looking back on some cover notes that I had done on this very subject, that judgment is heavily based on knowledge and on experience, but also on that crazy thing called intuition. And I know that if I can just come back to Malcolm Gladwell for a moment, he gives a number of examples, and I won't bore the listeners with us now, but he gives a number of examples where people made instinctive half-second judgments that were questioned by their peers, but turned out after the event to be absolutely right. And yet sometimes the rationality argued against them. So I'm kind of big on intuition, but then I have quite a few years of history and learning and principles and experience and knowledge that I think goes into that vault, that magic vault that we call intuition, and that helps judgment.
Yep. Ian, I'm mindful of time, and this has been a long interview because it's been fascinating, and we are going to have to wrap up soon. The interesting thing with this, and it's a personal theory, that I believe that leadership has been and gone. I think that leadership is archaic, and I don't like the word anyway. And I have a lot more faith in teams working together to solve stuff than having a leader. And, so many of the fuck-ups of the world have been caused since World War II with more leadership training than the world's ever seen, and we've spent billions of dollars on it, and a lot of that leadership has caused the problems that we're facing now. That's a personal view. But I look at this list you've got here, and I think of a team of people with these attributes, what they could achieve would be stunning.
This is this is very, very hot, I think, and very significant, because if you can put, as you say, a team of people that have these characteristics together, you will be unbeatable.
Yeah.
And I mean unbeatable, not in that old competitive sense, but in the right sense. I mean, the final comment I'd make about leadership, it's a completely obsolete concept now. It's been placed, in my view, by effectiveness. Collective intelligence is very good at producing effective people. But effectiveness requires team integration. So a natural and obligatory part of effectiveness is the ability to work in a team. And how you work in a team in the future, in my view, comes back to the 8 factors that we've just been talking about. End of story.
Yeah. Cool. So we're going to wrap up there, Ian. That's the end of the story. Ian, thank you so much for the time today for this, because when you said you'd done this research, I thought I just need to understand it more, and to have it hot off the press is fabulous. And I look at these and go, okay, so this was Generation Z. I think it relates to all generations. So, if boomers could take this on, they would operate a lot better as well. So, Ian, thank you very much for that, and I've appreciated your time. Just quickly, if people want to find you, what's your website?
www.businessgenetics.co.nz.
Cool. So we'll have that on the website. They'll be able to find you. And, thank you so much for this. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciated the chance.
Cool. You've just been listening to an episode of Stuff That Matters Now, brought to you by Collective Intelligence. I hope you enjoyed listening to the fun stuff, the rugged stuff, and the complete stuff-ups that have helped this particular Collective Intelligence member evolve while making the world a better place. Do check out our Stuff That Matters Now podcast series on your favourite podcast provider, or visit our website www.collectiveintelligence.co.nz to get links to new episodes. Contact us if you want to learn more about how we can help you evolve yourself and others. Thanks for listening.